So these, I have two amendments, or three, or a few actually, four, in this section relating to the spatial and economic, the regional spatial and economic strategy. And one of those is, again, relates to the issue of targets for social and affordable housing in the section that refers to the location of housing and the provision of housing in any national or regional population growth targets. And we propose to including targets around social and affordable housing. To my mind, this is again critical. If we just base our planning for housing purely on the basis of, if you like, the number of houses we need, but don't take into account the ability of people who live in that region to actually be able to afford those houses, we're going to have a problem. And we need to sort of get it into our heads that, well, first of all, we've always needed, the state has always needed to subsidise the provision of housing, the cost of housing, for a significant section of our population, always. But there was a school of thought which took hold in the 70s and 80s, neoliberalism, which imagined we could just let the market rip and we'd roll back on the provision of social and affordable housing, which was standard, you know, in the 40s, 50s, 60s in this country. Probably half, certainly 30 to 40% of all housing that was built by the state, sometimes as much as half, was social housing. And then it reduced to probably, you know, single figure percentages in terms of the proportion of housing that was built in the height of the sort of Thatcherite neoliberal era, and it's been a disaster. It's been a total disaster. So we need to start, and this needs to be written into our sort of regional, spatial and economic planning, is an awareness. If you look at average house prices now, about 70% of working people cannot afford them. They can't afford them. That means the plan has to acknowledge that in terms of the housing provision over the period of that plan. It has to be aware that 60 to 70% of the people in that region will not be able to afford the average house price. And if that isn't part of the plan, it's not very good planning. And the problem is, at the moment, we have a 10% requirement, gone up to 10% social and affordable. It's not enough. It's well short of what's needed in terms of subsidising the cost of housing. And, you know, I don't really agree with what Deputy Healy-Rae said, but it can increase the cost of housing if you want the housing to be better insulated, better retrofitted, you know, less guilty of carbon emissions and so on. It can. There's other ways of mitigating that, and of course, actually you reduce energy use if a house is when insulated, so there's swings and roundabouts on all of that, but it can increase the cost of housing, but we still have to provide people with housing. And better if that housing is well insulated, so it reduces your energy bills and releases less carbon. But if that does raise the cost, and in any event, as I said, the cost of housing is not affordable in terms of what the market can provide for 60 or 70% of people, then the planners need to be acknowledged that, because we have to have housing for the people. And they have to be able to afford it. So I think, therefore, it is appropriate to have targets in regard to that, where you look at the population and you say, this is the population, this is the housing requirement necessary to house that population, and this is the proportion of that population that are never going to be able to afford those houses. Therefore, somehow, the state has to make sure that 60 or 70% of people who are being priced out of it are not going to be priced out of it. And if that means state subsidies, that's what you do. And in my mind, we're giving loads of flippant subsidies to developers. You know, they get loads of subsidies. There's corporate welfare for them. So I see no problem whatsoever in subsidising ordinary people to put a roof over their head. Does any of that conflict? So that's why the logic behind that particular amendment. Does that conflict? Because we have also included amendments which strengthen what the government's amendment is in terms of climate obligations and biodiversity obligations, to say that it should be prepared. Consistent with the national international climate obligations and pursuant to Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Act. That's just trying to be absolutely clear that it's not just taking cognizance of these things, but it is prepared it's consistent in its preparation with those things. And I do not believe that there is, or should be, there can be at times, but there shouldn't be, if we do it right, a conflict between meeting those obligations to protect biodiversity and to protect, to meet our climate obligations and to provide the housing that we need for people. You can do both, but it requires planning. And it requires a real commitment and the resources and so on to do it in order to get it right. But we absolutely have to do it because if we don't protect nature, if we don't protect biodiversity, and if we don't address the climate crisis, we won't be able to live on this planet at all. We won't be able to grow the food, we won't be able to have the clean air, we won't be able to have the water and so on, the clean water that we need to actually exist on this planet. And it is possible to do those things, but you have to plan in order to do it right, and that's why we're proposing those amendments to make sure that we are consistent with those obligations.